Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for that great introduction. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's go over today's agenda really quickly. Why is the Chinese market important? Opportunities and challenges. Best practices for brand protection and effective enforcement, and tips for avoiding and resolving enforcement issues. So just to preface all this, brand protection strategies in China, specifically gravitation towards enforcement, is a topic that isn't going anywhere for brand owners. And that makes sense because China not only represents this place where a lot of the counterfeit goods are manufactured, but Asia also represents this real growth opportunity. And having not only to compete with counterfeit goods going out, but also having to try to compete to be able to have your products take hold in these emerging markets. And there's a number of real pain points for brand owners associated with this. But you add on top of that another pain point, which is that it's different operating in China. It's extremely different. And so to be able to have success there, you can't take what you do in other parts of the world, just apply it there and have success. And there are some really important components that you have to be able to manage. And the good news is that there's a lot of investment being made in understanding those nuances and those processes of these marketplaces. And that's going to be the focus of these slides. We're going to show you what it is that you can do and what professional service organizations can help you accomplish. We're going to highlight some of the biggest differentiators between trying to navigate the space alone or recognizing where the value is in engaging with local partnerships. So let's start out with a couple facts about the Chinese internet economy. With over 667 million internet users, that number of internet users outnumbers the entire U.S. population, 2 to 1. That's a pretty big statistic. And Chinese internet penetration, 48% of all internet users worldwide are in China. And then we have e-commerce sales in China. Chinese online shoppers currently number more than 361 million. And their sales are outpacing those of the United States, who has been the longtime leader in online shopping. So we're talking about $800 spent annually per Chinese netizen shopping online. So let's take a look at the landscape. Our conversation today is going to focus primarily on China, but you can see how these emerging marketplaces are taking hold throughout the region, and the number is constantly growing. So primarily we're going to be talking about the biggest players in the area, as well as the other emerging marketplaces taking hold. So as they grow and consolidate, they're also propagating competition, and that is what is ending up shaping the e-commerce landscape in Asia. So it's important to know, we're going to kind of go back to this several times, where to focus your efforts and have a multifaceted approach and how to engage with these different marketplaces and the different nuances associated with the country and even regionally within the country. So let's take a look at the opportunities and challenges. So, like I said before, we're talking about major local purchasing power with $800 per netizen spent online, and also the incredible growth and potential with the emerging Chinese e-commerce market. So not only do you have to address local distribution of your products, you have to combat counterfeits that are leaving the area. And remember that it's the world's workshop for legitimate and counterfeit goods. And the production and sale of counterfeit goods is a global, multi-billion-dollar problem, and one that has serious economic ramifications for businesses and consumers. Counterfeit sales represent more than 8% of all global trade. So let's talk about understanding the scope of the problem. Some of the general facts that I threw out are because you need to know the scale of counterfeiting in general to see how big your problem is and see how it fits in. So we need to know what the size of the problem is and in order to be able to know what kind of resources you as a brand owner need to dedicate towards developing and implementing a successful enforcement strategy. So if you take anything away from these slides, let it be these couple of points. And these are the topics we're going to elaborate on throughout these slides. Building a strong IP portfolio, understanding the scope and being able to prioritize your enforcement efforts, the importance of regional monitoring and enforcement, and leveraging local expertise. So we're going to start with building a strong IP portfolio. So this is maybe the most important step you need to take in terms of, being able to have an enforcement strategy that's actually impactful and working. It starts with building a strong IP portfolio. So registering trademarks in all relevant regions and classes. This is a huge one. What we often see is that once a brand has registered their trademark within the class for their product, they don't think about the other classes that their brand could be brand jacked or misused in. And this is huge, and it happens actually very often. For example, if you're a shoe manufacturer, but you find that somebody else in China has registered your brand name and is producing backpacks, you're losing a lot of recourse. You don't really have the ability to go to them and demand that they take it back or give it back rather. So this is a huge problem. So when we're building our IP portfolios, we need to be proactive. And that not only includes making sure that you're covering all the classes for your product, but you're covering every variation. So within China specifically, we often see multiple transliterations of brand names into Chinese characters. So you might have 3 or 4 different ways that are commonly used to translate your brand name into Chinese. Beyond that, we're also talking about simplified and traditional characters. And these are going to be used depending on, this is another thing about regions, depending on where you are in China. So as far as registration goes, it takes a lot of consideration to make sure that you are including everything that you possibly can. And that's going to be your ammunition for enforcement down the road. Another thing is being prepared to meet country-specific requirements. So many of these marketplaces, they will demand original copies or scans of original copies, and there's this preparation phase that's very important. So they'll want color copies, they'll want records of any address change, anything that is different than the certificate that you're getting them. So we have to build this chain of custody. Businesses change, businesses move, they're renamed, and this is something to consider and make sure that this is all being thoroughly documented so you're not having to go back and re-register these trademarks, which is an extremely time-consuming process. So make sure that you're being good stewards of all the necessary documentation in your portfolio. And then providing proof of authorizations to use trademarks if any brand's registered under a different company name. With subsidiaries and with multiple names being used by businesses, this one's very important. So again, we are making sure that we're able to clearly show how each of these marks relate to each other and how each of them relate to each business that are planning on using them for enforcement. And then another big one is registering trademarks prior to launch of new products in each class and region targeted to promote or protect your brand. This is another big one because being proactive again and starting the process earlier is going to limit the risk of your brand being hijacked. before you're able to secure that trademark or patent. And then when it comes to enforcement, as you're registering these things and you're looking at your product, kind of roadmap, make sure that you're communicating, if you're working with an organization, what is going to be available when as far as documentation and securing different IPR. And that's because you can actually, stop a lot of future infringement by making sure that everybody is aware of what is coming up for your brand, and making sure that all the necessary protection is in place for when that product finally becomes available and starts being sold. Because we know that as soon as it starts being sold, it's going to start being counterfeited, if not before. And then engage with local resources to verify the strength of trademark rights. It is all about relationships in China. And you need to start forging these relationships with native speakers specifically, who are going to be able to let you know that your IP portfolio is as strong as you believe it is. And they're going to be able to maybe reveal different ways that your brand might be being used and different trademarks that you might not have originally thought of to secure for your brand. I know an issue that's coming up more and more are products with multiple versions and not including the version within the trademark itself. So I have, a brand of headphones, and then I release the headphones 2.0. You need to make sure that you have that trademark for Headpoints 2.0, making sure you're covering all of your bases. The next one is a tricky one, and it's not always practical just because of the nature of the way that images are used to advertise and promote products, specifically on your websites. But maintaining a reference library of your copyrighted imagery and for both past and present products is extremely valuable, because you might see somebody advertising your product, or rather their product, their knockoff, with your images, but maybe those images no longer are posted on the website because it is an old product. So when you go to enforce, the marketplaces are going to ask where they can see that image being used, and if you can't point them to it, then you have to be able to provide some sort of documentation that, yes, this is our image that they're using without our consent. And then maintain an updated patent portfolio to complement copyright and trademark enforcement efforts. Again, what you're doing is you're building ammunition to go after the sellers, no matter how they're going to try and market the counterfeit products. You might find as seller behavior changes, as you're implementing your program, that there's a shift away from copyrighted images, which is one of the easier ways to get things down, the really low-hanging fruit, if you will. And then you start going after the trademark abuse, your logo, your name, false association, brand confusion. But counterfeiters will adapt eventually to that too, and find ways to market their item by maybe misspelling your brand name or hiding keywords with your brand name in the metadata of the page. So patent and having that strong patent portfolio is then going to be your next course of action, because if they're trying to sell these products and you have a really strong design patent, they're not going to be able to take it much further than that. It's kind of hard for them to argue when you have that patent. All right, understanding the scope and prioritizing enforcement. So you need to know how big of a problem that you have, and you have to be able to invest the time and other resources into fully understanding how big it is, how widespread it is. And it also allows you to benchmark where you're at when you begin your program. So down the road, you can look back and say, okay, is what we're doing really having an impact? Are we being successful, or do we need to change course in a different direction to, kind of have more of an impact? So understanding the scope of your underlying problem, and also understanding what your underlying problem is. And this is a big one. And it's difficult because oftentimes brand owners have multiple problems. So you might have a counterfeit problem, but you very well might also have an affiliate and distribution problem, a gray market problem, and understanding that will let you tailor your solution so that you're going after whatever you have identified that is having the most negative impact on your business. Right. And then disrupting counterfeiters and it being a hard target. And we're going to elaborate more on this. Make sure that you are being proactive about enforcement. When you have a ton of infringing listings that you're faced with, but maybe you're only enforcing once a month or only when it gets to the point that you can't ignore it and you have to be proactive and deal with it. By regularly delisting and keeping that level low, by making it just a part of your daily workflow, you're not going to have to worry about that giant buildup and then scrambling around to figure out how you're going to get stuff down. You're keeping it at a manageable level, but you're also keeping the marketplaces or the most visited parts of the marketplaces cleaner for people looking for authentic product. And then whatever listings you come across, categorize them, either if they're counterfeit or gray market or legitimate, because you're going to deal with them in different ways. And by making sure that the counterfeits are going to be dealt with in the best way we know how to deal with counterfeit, and the gray markets are dealt with in a different way. You're solving different pieces of the larger issue strategically, as opposed to just trying to get everything down under one umbrella reason. And then high-value targets. So there is a difficult balance to strike between high-value targets and then this regular delisting and the keeping the front pages of the marketplaces clean. And they really go in tandem. So you might think that going after these small sellers, maybe they only have 100 things listings, or they might have 1,000, but they're not the manufacturer. You're not tackling it at the source of the problem. But these things have to be done together. So you have to keep regularly enforcing, keeping those marketplaces cleaner than they were, and then also being investigative and making sure that you're investing and identifying those high-value targets, and then being able to handle them in a different way than you're handling the everyday seller on a marketplace. Knowing the difference and knowing where you're going to get the most impact is very important. And so we have items or processes like controlled buys to identify the suppliers. These are extremely valuable, and there's a wealth of information available about being able to navigate that process because they have very strict guidelines on how you maintain a chain of custody with an item, how you are going to present it back to the marketplace and say, hey, we bought this, we confirmed it was fake. There's just a whole bunch of hoops that you have to jump through, so you want to make sure that you're collecting all the right information at all the right steps. And again, engaging with the professional services organization who can help you navigate that process efficiently would be of a huge benefit to you. Understanding marketplace demerit systems. And this is a huge one because it can get quite confusing. Just like enforcing on each marketplace, each of those marketplaces operates with their own unique set of rules and standards for their sellers. So some are as simple as, say, a 3-strike policy. So no time frame, they just get 3 strikes and then their store might be suspended or shut down for good. Others can be way more complex than that. So you might have a marketplace whose policy is okay, so depending on the type of infringement, they might give a different strike against the seller's record. So a copyright violation might not have the same impact on their selling ability that consistently going after their counterfeit items for the counterfeit reason would. And then on top of that, you also have these moving time frames. So from the enforcement side, to get the most impact on some marketplaces, they'll say, okay, well, hit the seller once and get a listing down, and then wait 3 days and then hit the seller again. And by doing so, they're establishing a pattern where they're not changing their behavior based off your enforcements. And consistently enforcing in that way is going to demonstrate to the marketplace that, this is a persistent seller, and, they are in violation of the marketplace's terms of service, and you might be able to get more stores shut down that way. And then another thing to be aware of is that these policies are always changing. And I know a lot of them, the point systems, they'll actually reset annually or every few months, so that's something to be aware of too. But yeah, as the Chinese marketplaces change their own policies, the demerit policies are also changing with them. So keeping up to date when you're notified of any change that's happening to their terms of service, that's extremely important. All right, regional monitoring and enforcement. So prepare to constantly evolve your enforcement strategy. And this is very important because we talk about changing selling behavior a lot. And as you are finding ways to go after the counterfeit merchandise, the counterfeiters are constantly evolving their strategy as well. So something that worked today might not work tomorrow. You might have to come up with a completely different approach. And you're also being responsive and aware to overall changes in the landscape. So is there a trend of the way that these counterfeit sellers are changing their listings, or they're making it harder for you to take them down? And being, diligent about keeping up to date and being thoughtful of the clues that, you kind of see in the changes of seller behavior will help you have a more effective strategy and a more consistent strategy. And then be able to adapt internal processes to specific marketplace requirements and enforcement guidelines. So this is extremely important, because, again, what might work on one marketplace might not work on the other. And if you keep doing something that's not working, you're never going to have an impact. You're never going to be able to clean up the marketplace. So by understanding kind of the individual nuances of each of the marketplaces, how they operate, how responsive they are, that's very important. And then understanding your distribution partners and affiliates in each marketplace. Another really common thing we see is that people will originally have a distribution agreement, but it quickly kind of snowballs out of hand. So a handful of authorized distributors can quickly turn into a nightmare when they begin to authorize their own partners. So this is often due to weak affiliate agreements and guidelines. The distribution channel can quickly grow out of control. And the result is that while your original distributors might only sell authentic product, the bottom of the barrel, the bottom of this chain, we start to actually see authentic product mixed with counterfeit goods. And this can be avoided by strengthening agreements and being tough on those distributors who break them. And this goes for a distributor or any business that has maybe 5 authorized dealers or even 500. And, it's being diligent about tracking how these agreements are being made. I've seen organizations where they think they have maybe 15 authorized distributors in China, and through the process of, being proactive and enforcing and taking down the unauthorized content, the unauthorized listings from non-distributors, they were discovering they had many more distributors than they actually thought. So what started out as 15, a year into an enforcement process has now snowballed to, oh, there's actually 130 authorized distributors. And then maintain separate goals and strategies for addressing gray market versus counterfeit. Now, there is a lot of overlap when it comes to enforcement as far as the ways that you try to get infringing listings down. But know that your gray market problem isn't going to be solved in the same way that your counterfeit problem might be, and they're going to require different approaches. Many times they require more of a soft approach, so despite it being authentic product, probably they might be using your copyrighted images without your consent, and that could be used as leverage to get listings down off these marketplaces. And then set realistic goals that prioritize making a counterfeit version of your product hard to find by consumers. And this again goes back to striking that balance between diligent daily enforcement, or at least a regular pattern of enforcement, and then going after those high-value targets. They have to be done in tandem. But know that you're not going to get everything down overnight, no matter how, aggressively you start enforcing. It's going to take time. And you're going to notice that the more you enforce, again, as you're changing seller behavior, you're going to have to be adapting your strategy to make sure that your brand continues to be a hard target for counterfeiters. Great. Utilize local, professional, and native speakers for review. This is an extremely important point. Having boots on the ground and having local partners and native speakers engaging with regional resources, so like legal counsel, for example, who we said you should be engaging with locally to make sure your IP portfolio is as strong as it can possibly be. And you're taking advantage of all this expertise that's really already out there in order to develop your own brand protection strategy that is going to be high impact when implemented. Establishing relationships is one of the most important things in Asia, and you have to be able to maintain those relationships. So having local expertise can really be a differentiator between a successful and an ineffective program. So you have that Chinese expertise. You also have that same time zone, which is very important, and just being close to these different locations, these marketplace headquarters, that's another important part about the relationship building, because it's about establishing trust with the marketplace at the end of the day. And that way you're able to actually sit and work through problems as they come up. So that's some of the investment that organizations are making, is having boots on the ground. And those are the things that are really accelerating in that area right now. And you also have to know how to leverage those relationships. In order to be able to do that, you have to support and focus on building them. So escalate unresolved issues outside of the standard IPR process. We have to be careful with the way that we engage with marketplaces. So as we're building trust and we're solidifying those relationships that are going to help you have a successful enforcement program, be wary of being too aggressive, because the more aggressive you are, if you're not being responsive to what the marketplaces are telling you, you say, oh, well, these are all counterfeit by virtue of being on this website, or, the price point is too low, take them down, they have to be counterfeit. Well, if it's a marketplace that won't let you use price point as, a single, you can't use price point alone as an indicator, but that's the only thing you're able to provide to them, and you're not being responsive to them saying, hey, you also need to provide, this information, or you need to approach it in a different way. They might down the road, you might have additional scrutiny on the things that you submit to them, and it could slow everything down, anything from the time it takes them to process your enforcements, and the longer it takes for them to do that, of course, the more opportunities there are for people to be purchasing these counterfeit goods. And then if you're entirely unresponsive to what they're trying to tell you, hopefully this doesn't happen, but you don't want to end up on some banned list where, they've decided internally based on, the way that you are enforcing that, you're not being responsive and you're not operating within their, kind of guidelines. So they're just not going to deal with you. So leverage intelligence gained from monitoring and enforcement for valuable insights into developing marketplaces. This is a huge one. So when we think about enforcement and what a successful enforcement strategy is and what a successful enforcement program looks like, it's really easy to only see it in terms of volume. So the number of listings we got down, the number of items that they were advertising that were shut down, and the price. Those are all important things, and that's key that you do want to enforce in volume when you get to that point, and you do want to be taking a lot of things down to keep those front pages clean and keep consumers from stumbling across those counterfeit items. But also, there's a tremendous amount of data that you're gaining from these listings, and that can be lost, I think, a little too easily because that could be usable to developing your strategy. So as imagine all the data points, all the pieces of information that a single marketplace listing has, tracking that and then using that to identify, okay, it looks based off of all this information we've collected from these listings that these counterfeiters are moving towards lower volume to avoid suspicion, but maybe they're posting more listings. So definitely make sure that you're taking advantage of everything that you get when you're engaging with marketplaces and you're reviewing these listings and enforcing. And then you have to be flexible and vigilant. So, when we say being flexible with your strategy, again, that is knowing that as marketplaces are constantly evolving, their policies are changing, your brand is evolving, and so are the counterfeiters. We always have to be one step ahead, and in order to do that, we have to be leveraging that intelligence we're getting from them and changing to be able to address the way that they're now operating. And then being vigilant, like I said, that's consistently enforcing, and that's going to go a long ways as you're establishing those, relationships of trust with the marketplace. If they see that you're being consistent with taking stuff down, that this is, a program that isn't going away, it's going to help you a lot down the road. And you have to be creative, just as creative as the counterfeiters are and other infringers are. Maybe if you're having trouble getting something down or getting any momentum using one strategy, there's definitely a lot to be said for trying something new. Thinking of ways to, for example, take down a counterfeit item where they're not using your image, they're not using your trademark, it is counterfeit. You then have to come up with a way to make that case without, those really obvious indicators. And as your program, evolves, and once you're, pretty far down the road into it, you're going to see so many changes that being creative becomes necessary. And then also being calculated. And that is all that pre-work where you're understanding the scope of the problem. You have clear goals for each of the problems. You understand, just how much is out there and where you want to be a year, 2 years down the road. And then that you're also doing those things such as if a marketplace has a demerit policy where you have to enforce every 3 days for, the most impact, then that's being strategic and calculated by timing your enforcements in that way. And then again, leveraging local expertise, and we talk about that relationship building. So leveraging a recognized partner in brand protection helps build the trust with sites and improves compliance rates. So beyond just having local expertise or a deep understanding of the lay of the land, having organizations to partner with who have already really invested in building those relationships and working things out with the various exchanges is going to take your program, above and beyond what you might be able to accomplish initially off the bat. So the investment has already been made, and the footwork has already been done. So definitely take advantage of that local knowledge and expertise, and teams of people who are it's their job to understand those changes in marketplaces and their policies and changes in seller behavior. It's, you might be able to navigate it alone, but it's certainly a lot easier if you have experts to help you do it. And then leveraging the relationships with the marketplaces. Again, established and strengthened relationships with these marketplaces over many years. If you join an organization or partner with an organization that's already done that, then you get to definitely directly benefit from those relationships that we are constantly investing in maintaining and growing. And then helping you succeed with typical enforcement issues as well as unique problems that require a customized approach. So again, those are the, that's being creative. And the less straightforward stuff that's out there, there are ways to, achieve your goals to get those things down, but sometimes it takes more of a custom approach. And again, you can't just take the same strategies that you use elsewhere and apply them to Chinese marketplaces and expect to have the same results. All right, so I'd like to go over a couple potential scenarios, and potential, I suppose, is a little misleading because these things I have seen all of them more than once. So a global brand was trademarked in China for a product that the owner didn't make in a class they had not already registered in before by an infringer. So that example I gave of a shoe company discovering that someone had trademarked their brand to make backpacks. It's not a good position to be in, and it just drives point home about having the best IP portfolio that you can, having the strongest portfolio that you can, and sometimes that requires preemptively trademarking things and classes that your business doesn't make or you don't plan to make in the future, just to protect yourself. And then renewal certificates. So the importance of documentation. I said that we see marketplaces require originals or colored copies, and with all the addendums and documentation along with it, if you let those trademarks lapse, if you don't, be very careful about tracking your renewal schedule, because you could be looking at a year maybe of waiting for your trademark to renew if you let it expire in the first place. And that's a year where you're not able to leverage your intellectual property to take this stuff down. And that can be a major setback to your program if suddenly, maybe now all you can enforce on are, things using copyrighted images when there's all this trademark abuse out there that you've lost the ability to leverage. And then this is an important one as well. An emerging brand keeps us up to date with new product launches and maintains access to historical images. So we're helping each other to maintain the best possible relationship with these Chinese marketplaces by knowing what to expect and when it's coming. So an example of this would be a brand owner who will let us know that, okay, well, we've never made this product before, but it's going to be out in July. So we can immediately start planning ahead and leveraging the release date of a project to maybe even enforce on product that's already out there, but shouldn't be just because it hasn't been released yet. And so you see these counterfeit versions of products oftentimes before the product is actually released. And if you have that time frame and you're aware of it, then you can maybe ramp up your enforcement efforts significantly over that time period while you can leverage that information. So again, Chinese marketplaces represent a tremendous revenue opportunity for your business. There's no question that you need to be engaged with the Chinese marketplaces because it's not going anywhere. And then again, it's also the workshop for legitimate goods as well as counterfeit. Don't get discouraged with challenges, rather acquire expertise in how to manage them. It can be incredibly frustrating when you're unable to, persuade marketplaces to take down infringing items that you as the brand owner are 100% sure that they're infringing, but they might be throwing up walls or their policies might be making it difficult for you to get anything down. So, and that goes back to being creative and adaptive, and then having the expertise on, how to deal with these problems as they arise. But you don't want to get encouraged if you feel that, oh, this marketplace just isn't going to play ball. They're not going to cooperate with us at all. That's, shouldn't be the case. You just need to know what their expectations are and how to leverage, relationships with those marketplaces to have success. And you do that by finding a partner to guide you and help you navigate the landscape. People have already invested in those relationships and understanding the nuances of all the marketplaces and the best ways to navigate them. And then leveraging best practices for local enforcement. And that's another aspect of having local speakers, or native speakers rather, who understand the policies of the marketplace and can actually enforce from, with boots on the ground, again, which is oftentimes a lot more effective than doing it entirely from abroad. All right, and with that, I think we're going to take a couple questions.
Trevor, it looks like a couple of questions have come in. One that just came in is, do you need copyright registrations to take down listings on Alibaba and Taobao?
So this is an interesting question because things are changing in that area quite a bit and just recently. Yes and no. So if your copyrighted material is on your website, for Alibaba, what you have to do is verify that you actually own the website and control the content on it. And oftentimes, usually all that requires is being able to show that, the relationship between who's listed on the website's whois information, who's the website owner, and with your business that has registered with Alibaba for enforcement. So if you can draw that line, then they can suddenly use your website as a point of reference for copyright infringement complaints. But more and more registration is becoming important, and a lot of marketplaces are kind of becoming more strict on only enforcing for a registered copyright and not just copyrighted by virtue of being on your website.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question that came in, do you have any additional strategies for companies that offer services, for example, hotels and restaurants, rather than hard goods?
Yeah, so those have to be approached a little differently. If you have your service marks, you can find stores on Chinese marketplaces, shops owned by sellers who market your product as a service as opposed to, selling you a physical good. So a lot of the abuse we see would be your brand's trademark being used like on a store head, or them, promoting their own services using your images and material. So you can get shops closed down if it looks like they're trying to promote a service that you have, the trademarked service for.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. We did have some questions come in through chat, so I just want to give a reminder, please use the Q&A tab on the screen to submit your questions. So here's one follow-up question to the copyright registration. Is it Chinese copyright registration or any other country registration, or such as U.S.?
So typically for copyright, U.S. is fine, especially for Alibaba. We haven't really, we can't see yet what the impact of this is going to be, but it is a noticed trend that they're requiring registration. So my advice would be to try and kind of get in on the ground floor, and while you're, getting those registrations, go ahead and make sure that you have, submitted everything that you can at this point without having to do that. So make sure that, you're using your website as a point of reference for copyrighted imagery. And again, maybe now would be a good time to start making those, albums, those historical images available as well.
Okay, one more question. Sometimes enforcement feels like playing whack-a-mole. Is it even worth it to go after the small-time seller?
Yes, absolutely. And yes, it does feel like playing whack-a-mole a lot of the time. And we see the same things with websites as well, but that's about being vigilant and making sure that, while yes, we want to get to the high-value targets and we want to stop these counterfeit products from, leaving even the distribution point, the source. Enforcing regularly and consistently on even the small sellers, that's how you're going to keep the first, the most public pages of those marketplaces clean of counterfeit. And that's how you're going to build those trust relationships with marketplaces, by being consistent with your enforcements and sending good enforcements by, kind of playing by their guidelines. And you will notice that the more that, you're actively enforcing on even the small sellers, it's going to drive them to go towards another product. So that's making your brand a hard target. They're not going to want to be, misusing your brand if, they're constantly having their store shut down and they have to reopen one and rebuild their seller rating, et cetera. So, yes, it is important to keep playing the whack-a-mole.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. One more question that came in is very similar to the copyright question, but regarding trademarks. So, meaning, is a U.S. trademark registration sufficient for trademark enforcement on Alibaba for generic use of our trademark?
Yep, absolutely. So, Alibaba and AliExpress will accept U.S. trademarks. And once you have those approved by Alibaba and they're uploaded, that's going to let you enforce using those marks to match whatever the misuse is. So if it's brand confusion or counterfeit even, those U.S. trademarks will work.